Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Airaj Barucha. I am Director of Bharati Vidya-mitra Environment Education and Research in Pune. This module is the second part of Nature and Cultures in India. It is part of the Environment and Society program that you are undergoing. The important thing to understand in this section is the specific learning objectives which we have. The first is how are livelihoods of coastal and marine freshwater dependent communities related to nature and their own ecosystem? What constitutes the current impacts on coastal folk and on the islanders that we have? How are artisans and nomadic people related to India's mainstream cultures? And we try to round up by saying, how have natural landscapes altered communities and how have communities altered these landscapes? Part one of this session focused on foraging tribal people, agricultural communities, on people who do animal husbandry, and those who were dependent on NTFP, non-timber forest products, and on pastoralism. This was really the basis on which we looked at the first part of these two sessions. The current part, which is part two, focuses on coastal and inland aquatic ecosystem people, but it also focuses on those people who are not necessarily rooted to certain areas, such as nomads and artisans, who are found across India in various different patches and would even move from one place to another. We will also look at the current trends of changes in landscapes, which are due to globalization, homogenization, and so on. The coastal and marine systems are basically people who are fisher folk. And you find fisher folk on both the western coast as well as the eastern coast, which are living in small communities which are dotted across beaches, across estuaries, across riverine deltas, and so on. So they have a strong linkage to the aquatic systems that you have. The traditional people have changed a lot in the recent past due to mechanized fishing, and therefore this has led to a large amount of destruction of fisheries. We also have inland freshwater fishing systems and inland people who are basically dependent on rivers, on wetlands, on lakes, on ponds, and they too have this very strong linkage to the aquatic system. The marine fisher folk have a strong traditional knowledge of systems that come from the sea, and they understand its faunal abundance, they understand its diversity in a very deep sense from their traditional knowledge systems. So these people are able to exploit these resources both sustainably as well as very functionally. The other aspect of these coastal people is that India has had links to both the west and east through trading positions that they had for maritime trade for thousands of years. And this is something which has links to what we have in present. So our present ports are often related to very ancient port systems which our local traditional people had. The other aspect is those people who live in our mangrove deltas. These fisher folk are very specific to these regions because mangroves are some of the richest ecosystems that we have in terms of diversity as well as in terms of the biomass that is being produced. And these people live now in a very threatened ecosystem. The very fact of climate change, which will raise sea levels by even 2 or 3 feet, would cause devastation to these mangrove areas, and the mangrove areas would automatically become degraded and we would lose fish, crustacea, and so on. There would be a serious loss to fishing in the next few decades. The other reason why this happens is the fact that we have got trawlers, pollution, and a loss of traditional knowledge. All these three combined together create a huge stress on fishing communities, both marine as well as coastal. The coastal farmer are generally paddy cultivators, and they've been there from ancient times. Many of them have grown rice varieties which are not found nowadays, which have already disappeared. They are experts at bunding their coastal areas. They understand how to manage their soils, and they know extremely well how to select crop cultivars. Now, this art or science which is there is being very rapidly lost because of our traditional ways which are disappearing. And at the same time, we are more and more increasing fertilizers, we are more and more increasing pesticides and crop varieties which are genetically managed. So with these kind of situations, we will find that these traditional crop varieties will just vanish. Many of these coastal farmers are those who have grown coconuts, arecanut plantations, mango plantations for generations together. And they too are able to give you, for example, a very large varieties of mangoes today. Now, the other aspect of this is the South Indian coastal spice trade. And this occurred and grew during the Western influx of people coming from Europe in search of spices, which they then began to plant here, and the local people developed a trade agreement with these people. One of the aspects that we need to understand about coastal areas is the fact that this is a very disaster-prone ecosystem. The loss of life and property in our country that has occurred due to tsunamis, due to storms, has been enormous. And it disrupts their life repeatedly. Redevelopment for these people is often done in situ, and its consequences are terrible. So you have the loss of a village and their livelihood, and they are forced to come back and stay in the same place. So they will always live in a risk-prone area. The islands are our most segregated communities. They live in the Andaman, Nicobar Islands, and the Lakshadweep. These are India's most vulnerable tribal groups. The Ongi, the Jarawa, the Sentinelese, Nicobaris. They are primarily foragers of non-timber forest resources. And they are experts at gathering these resources. They are also experts at fishing. And unfortunately, we have not been able to give them the type of governance that they would be really settled with. So this whole rift that is there between the islanders and our people for some of these communities is something that we have not been able to bridge today. Much of what has happened in the islands is the settlers that have gone from the mainland. And they are the ones who have, for example, Lakshadweep has coconut plantations and fishing, which was primarily people who came from the mainland. Currently, today, there are huge impacts on the islands. And this is because of the type of government strategies that we have which deal with these tribal cultures. The fact that we now increasingly want the islands to have more and more tourism, it's bad for the ecology of the area, but it's also bad for these cultures. And we are going to lose both at the same time, and perhaps it's going to be extremely, extremely rapid. We need to understand how to balance what we want to do for these communities, as well as how we are going to use these resources on these islands sustainably. This is something which we have just not been able to do. What about other communities? There are a whole lot of communities that came into India over a long period of time. We had Jews coming in some 2,000 years ago, and then later Christian people coming into the west coast of India, settling there and actually integrating very well with the local community. We also had Sindhis who came on the west coast of Gujarat and Maharashtra about 1500 AD, who were brought either as slaves or they came as traders. And they have also settled there. In fact, we have also some small local states where the rulers have been Sindhis. The Parsis, Zoroastrians, came in to the Gujarat coast about 7th century AD, and have again integrated very well with the people who live in Bombay and Pune, for example. The Europeans who came initially as traders, and this is something very important to understand. They did not initially come in as conquerors. They came in as traders and then colonized our country and then began to rule. And this changed as time went by, over 200 years or so, with Dutch people coming and then Portuguese, French, and finally the British, who really took over this whole country. The other part of this program deals with people who are not necessarily settled across the territories of India and in the different ecosystems. There, they had a more or less pan-Indian biogeographic distribution, but were either local nomads or regional nomads or maybe even pan-Indian nomads. These nomadic people have lived with the mainstream cultures for generations together, very often in a very symbiotic way, but they have also had rifts between the nomads and the non-nomads. For example, the Pardis were hunters who basically trapped wildlife and were very often considered to be outside regular society. And till today, this is a very serious problem. We need to understand, how do we integrate these people into a better way of life? The Pardi is unfortunately extremely poor now. He is not allowed to hunt. He is persecuted, and therefore this is a very serious problem which we still need to solve. And there are a whole lot of very interesting communities. The Nandiwalas, who have a very specific type of breed of bull, which is trained to act out yes or no, depending on how the Nandiwala plays his drum and indicates to the bull what the answer should be. So you go to him and you say, oh, well, what is going to happen in my future life? And the Nandi will say whether it's going to be great or whether it's going to be miserable. So the Nandi bull is actually a fortune teller in a way, and he gets rewarded for that. And he is a nomad. He moves all over many parts of the country. Then there are Lambadas, there are Lamans, there are Banjaras. These are those who are suspected of having links with the gypsy communities, even up to Europe. And they are caravan people, and you see them moving all over the place across India. Some very interesting semi-nomadic type of people are the Dhangas, for example, in Maharashtra, who will move from one area into the next, depending on where grass is growing in the monsoon. Their lands, the lands that they never owned but grazed on, were semi-arid grassland areas. And it is these areas which are today most severely impacted in Maharashtra, for example, where the whole area now is becoming sugarcane plantations through canal irrigation, and the Dhangar therefore has no traditional land anymore to graze. And he, in his movement pattern, has had to change his whole way of life. Many Dhangars now have become settled in the central part of Maharashtra because of the routes that they used to use are now just completely not there. They're just cut off from their traditional migration routes. And more of the Dhangar, therefore, has changed his whole lifestyle. So initially they used to have sheep. Today they have more and more goats, and that's because the price of sheep's wool is not there anymore, but the type of meat that they can sell from goats is now much more easily saleable. So their whole way of life has changed because many of these areas have become industrial areas, there are roads passing through, and the grassland is gone, and you have got a whole change in a landscape in which the Dhangars lived for thousands of years. There are many interesting regional livelihood-based cultures. Like, for example, camel herders in Rajasthan. These are people who were traditional caravan people and traded with Afghanistan, Iran for thousands of years. Then, as an example, we have ironsmiths, We have ironsmiths all over the country. They are totally separate from each other. For example, they would make very beautiful artifacts. And many of their artifacts were based on biodiversity resources. So they made animals and so on, and things like that out of cast iron. There have also been very wonderful traditional tribal artists. The Warlis, for example, the Santals, the Gond, they've all had their own very interesting traditional artwork. And much of this is disappearing today because of homogenization. So you have Warli paintings done by commercial artists who make sharwal kameezes for ladies in urban areas. But Warli himself, who used to paint on the walls of his house, the lady who used to paint the walls on his house, calls upon a commercial artist to paint for her. So these are ways in which this is getting lost. Another very interesting phenomena is the pan-Indian group of potters. And they have made brilliant pottery over periods of time. They are very region specific. They know exactly which type of clay to use, where to get it from, how to mix it, how much proportion to use, and they can make you the most beautiful pots ever. One of the, again, pan-Indian type of livelihoods is the Vaidu, the people who can know about medicinal plants, which they collect from the forest. They are people who know medicinal plants of the Himalayas, of the Western Ghats, in the Central Highlands. Everywhere, the Vaidu has been a very specific person who knew enormous amount of traditional medicinal plants. Much of what we are talking about is in one way or another linked to legal issues. And these legal issues, many of these legal issues are a follow-up of what we inherited during the Mughal and the British period. So we need to understand that some of these had very unjust beginnings to start with. For example, in 1871, the British passed the Criminal Tribes Act, which has been a terrible thing for certain communities, to be dubbed criminal when you had done nothing, but you were just there because you were a criminal tribe. And this has led to enormous injustice in this country, which one needs to now address and perhaps just change many of the ways in which we look at it. So it's not just the act, it's how we look upon these people and what they are facing today in this homogenized world, having come from that tradition. The other one which I find very difficult to understand is what to do about purely forager communities based on hunting. These hunters are people who were using hunting as a means of livelihood, but also as their own food. Today, in many parts of this country, the hunter is illegal now because of the Wildlife Protection Act, and therefore he has no other means of doing this except practicing something which is illegal for his day-to-day livelihood, for whatever he can sell. So he might be selling pangolin scales, or he might be selling porcupine quills. He may be just a whole large variety of things that they have to trap. This is a very serious problem. One needs to find alternatives for them. We can't just leave them alone and then persecute them for something that they cannot really help today. And this is something that we need to address from the forest department, from the police department. It needs capacity building, not only for them to find alternative livelihoods, but for the people who very nearly persecute them. So I think this is something that we need to understand. Many of these communities are landless. They have no way to get into farming except as landless labor, which is always very heavily exploited. There is also this disparity between different laws. For example, the Forest Conservation Act versus the Forest Rights Act is very often at cross purposes with each other. And again, these need new solutions. unless we look at these new solutions from this legal perspective, answers cannot emerge. We need to perhaps even change some of these laws so that they become congruent in what we are thinking. I think the only law which seems to do this is the Biological Diversity Act of 2002. And it is the future. It is the future of how to look at resources, how to protect them, as well as how to use them at sustainable levels. If we are able to do this, then perhaps we will find a golden mean between conservation and the resources that local people need. And it would automatically then lead to some level of sustainable extraction. This is, I think, the answer of the future. One of the major issues that seems to ring through as a thread through both these sessions is the fact of how rural to urban transition has occurred in our country in the recent past. The drivers have been globalization, homogenization, education itself. And the result or the fallout has also been loss of individual cultures. So from one side, we want to save these individual cultures, but the way we look at these people who have indigenous cultures is to homogenize or globalize them. Where do we bring about this balance? I can't say that we have answers to all these things today. They need to be understood, and we as the larger community needs to become sensitized to these individual cultures. And unless we can do that, these cultures are going to vanish. We keep talking about endangered species. What about endangered cultures? I think these are two parallel issues, and both are very closely linked to each other. This whole thing that happens when you get globalization, homogenization, is a shift of people forced, as it were, to move from a rural area into the slums of a megacity. And automatically the cultural heterogeneity would get lost. It is not something that we can save by this kind of movement. The other is that once this transition from rural to urban occurs, there is the whole aspect of life that changes, which is dealing with consumerism. They automatically become more wasteful, and you have problems of waste management. There is automatically more pollution, and there are questions of health. So these linkages between what happens in the day-to-day lives of people due to changes in land use, land cover, and the way in which we look at rural to urban transition is perhaps a very, very important goal for us to look at in the future. Along with all this, what happens is a loss of environmental ethics, a loss of pro-environmental ethics. And when we lose ethics which are dealing with environment, we are automatically destroying a whole lot of cultures that are woven around these things. And finally, what sort of public education do we need? I think we need to sit and think these through. And I think each of us has to think these through, because we are all dealing with the same need for sensitivity to environment. So in summary, what really have we brought out in these two sessions? The first is we've tried to look at the cultural diversification that has occurred in our country. And diversification has been a part of India's history, both geographically and ecologically, over several thousand years. So it's not something that has happened which is new. It has always been there, but the pace has changed radically in the last few years, and certainly in the last few decades. And so natural landscapes have been altered by communities over a long period of time into traditional cultural landscapes, and now into what we could refer to as modern urban landscapes. But the impacts of this falls on cultural diversity today. One of the interesting patterns of change that occur over periods of time is what we see has happened with Warli painting, for example. Warlis are a tribal community on the western coast of Maharashtra, and they were predominantly paddy farmers. The Warlis had a tradition where the lady of the house would paint a sort of visualization of her lifestyle on the wall of a house where the new bride would come in, or sometimes for Diwali. So this was something which was done with a very typical type of style. Some years ago, there was a tribal exhibition in Delhi, some decades ago, and some people had invited Warli ladies to come and paint in a tribal village being created in Delhi. The women refused to go, until there was one young man there called Jivya Soma Marshe, who said, "Oh, I think if I tell them, they'll come with me, but you'll have to take me too." So Jivya went with 5 or 6 of these ladies, and they painted the walls of those tribal huts that were being created in Delhi. Jivya looked at these paintings and said, "Well, I think I can do this as well." So he took some brown paper and he painted Warli motifs on some brown papers, which he brought back to Bombay and was able to sell in an art gallery. Jivya became famous. And Jivya is now a Padma Shri. He's 80 plus, and he lives a happy life being a painter. But Jivya can look at a painting and practically say which village it comes from, and how those styles have changed over time. And he's aghast at the type of things that people call Warli paintings today. So you talk to Jivya and he'll tell you how his traditional artwork, which came from the village of his house, had been transferred to first young boys in the Warli community and now out into commercial artwork. This is how we can very rapidly lose very, very powerful traditional motifs. So if you look at a Warli painting, many of these will depict their farmland, the animals around them, their gods and goddesses, the mountain on which their famous temples are built, a whole lot of things which depict the landscape of the Warli people. I think this is going very fast. Similarly, we have the Gond painters from the Central Highlands, Bhopal, and that whole belt. And the Gond painters are left with very small families. One of them actually, who was the early Gond painter, who was known, went to Japan and unfortunately passed away there. And today there are small groups of Gond painters who make incredible work. They don't even need to sign their name, because their painting itself and the design in the painting depicts who the artist was. And most of these paintings are extremely beautiful. The majority of them are mythical animals which they join together, and they are able to depict a very different, very nearly ethereal life that they can experience. And they have fantastic imagination. They can just about produce anything. The colors that they use are tremendous. Initially, they always used to use herbal colors. Now, of course, they use camlin, krylin, whatever. So, again, here is a question of how to maintain their originality of that Gond painting. And I think these are things which are culturally being lost very rapidly, and all of them are in one way or another linked to environment. Much of what you have learned cannot be learned in a short period of time, or it cannot be transferred in a short period of time. And there is a lot of material on the net, on e-texts and so on, which you can really access if you need to know more about this. The question of livelihoods is a very big issue. The question of cultures and livelihood is a very big issue. And equally important now is to understand the linkage between ecology and social cultures.